Chapter 11 of Favorite Fairy Tales by Logan Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Evan Smith. Jack the Giant Killer. In the reign of King Arthur there lived in the county of Cornwall a worthy farmer who had an only son named Jack. Jack was strong and brave and very daring, and was never backward when danger was in the way. Now in those days there lived a huge giant in a gloomy cavern on St. Michael's Mount, which rises out of the sea near the shores of Cornwall. The Cornish people had suffered greatly from his thefts and pillaging, for he used to wade through the sea to the mainland and carry off half a dozen or more of their oxen at a time. At last Jack made up his mind to destroy this monster. He took a horn, a shovel, a pickaxe, and a dark lantern, and one winter's evening swam over the sea to the mount. Then he set to work, and before morning had dug a great pit. He covered it carefully over with sticks and straw, and strewn some earth on top to make it look like solid ground. And then he blew his horn so loudly that the giant awoke, and came out roaring like thunder. "You impudent villain, you shall pay dearly for disturbing my rest. I will broil you for my breakfast." But almost as he spoke he tumbled headlong into the pit. "Oh, ho, Mr. Giant," said Jack, "how is your appetite now? Will nothing serve you for breakfast but broiling poor Jack?" Then he struck the giant such a blow on the head with the pickaxe that he killed him. When the justices of Cornwall heard of this valiant deed, they sent for Jack, and declared that he should always be called Jack the Giant Killer, and they gave him a sword and a belt upon which was written in letters of gold, "This is the valiant Cornishman who slew the giant Cormoran." There was another giant in England called Blunderbore, who vowed to take revenge on Jack for his exploit. One day, as Jack was passing through a wood on a journey to Wales, he fell asleep by the side of a fountain. The giant, coming along, found him there, and seeing by the writing on the belt who Jack was, he lifted him on his shoulder and carried him off to his castle. When Jack awoke and found himself in the clutches of Blunderbore, he was terribly frightened. The giant carried him into a room and locked him up, while he went to fetch another giant who lived close by, to help him eat Jack for dinner. While he was gone, Jack heard dreadful shrieks and groans from different parts of the castle, and soon after he heard a mournful voice saying, "Haste, valiant stranger, haste away, lest you become the giant's prey. On his return he'll bring another, still more savage than his brother, a horrid, cruel monster who, before he kills, will torture you." Poor Jack looked out of the window, which was just over the gate of the castle, and saw two giants coming along arm in arm. "Now," thought he, "death or freedom is at hand." There happened to be two strong cords in the room, and Jack made a large noose with a slip knot in each of them. Then, just as the giants were coming through the gate, he threw the ropes over their heads, and, fastening the other ends to a beam in the ceiling, he pulled the ropes with all his might until he had nearly strangled the giants. Then he drew his sword and slipped down the ropes and killed them both. Next Jack took the keys from Giant Blunderbore and searched through the castle. In one of the rooms he found three ladies who told him that their husbands had been killed by the giant, who had afterwards condemned them to be starved to death. Jack gave them the castle and all the riches it contained, to make some amends for the dreadful pains they had suffered, and then went on his way. After traveling some days, he lost himself in a lonely valley, but when he had wandered about some while, he at length succeeded in finding a large house. He went up to it and knocked loudly at the gate, when, to his great horror, a monstrous giant with two heads came forth. He spoke very civilly, however, and took Jack into the house, leading him to a room where there was a good bed, in which he could pass the night. Jack took off his clothes, but though he was very tired, he could not go to sleep. Presently he heard the giant walking about in the bedchamber, which was the next room, saying to himself, "Though here you lodge with me this night, you shall not see the morning light. My club shall dash your brains out quite." When he heard this, Jack got out of bed, and taking a large thick piece of wood, he laid it in his own place in the bed, and hid himself in a dark corner of the room. In the middle of the night the giant came with his great club, and struck several heavy blows upon the bed. Then he went off, thinking he had broken all of Jack's bones. Early next morning Jack walked into the giant's room, and thanked him for the night's lodging. The giant was terribly startled to see him, and stammered out, "Oh, dear me, is it you? Pray, how did you sleep last night? Did you hear or see anything to disturb you?" "Nothing worth speaking of, thank you," answered Jack carelessly. "A rat, I believe, gave me 3 or 4 slaps with his tail, but that was all." The giant said nothing, but went and fetched 2 bowls of hasty pudding for their breakfast. Jack did not wish the giant to think that he could not eat as much as himself, so he contrived to fasten a leathern bag inside his coat. He then managed to slip the pudding into the bag while pretending to eat it. When breakfast was done, he said to the giant, "Now I will show you a fine trick. I can cure all wounds with a touch. You shall see an example." He then took a knife, ripped up the leathern bag, and all the hasty pudding tumbled out onto the floor. "Od splutter her nails!" cried the giant, who was ashamed to be outdone by such a little fellow. "How can you do that yourself?" And snatching up the knife, he plunged it into his stomach, and fell down dead. After this Jack went farther on his journey. In a few days he met King Arthur's only son, who was traveling into Wales to deliver a beautiful lady from the power of a wicked magician. Jack attached himself to the Prince, and they traveled on together. The Prince was very generous, and soon gave away all the money he possessed. After having parted with his last penny to an old beggar woman, he was very uneasy as to where they were going to pass the night. "Sir," said Jack, 2 miles farther on there lives a giant with 3 heads, who can fight 500 men at once and make them fly. I will go on and visit him. Do you wait here until I return." Jack rode on to the gates of the castle and gave a loud knock. The giant, with a voice like thunder, roared out, "Who is there?" "No one but your poor cousin Jack." "Well, what news, cousin Jack?" "Dear uncle, I have bad news for you. Here is the king's son coming with 2,000 men to kill you." "Cousin Jack, this is bad news indeed. But I have a large cellar underground, where I shall hide myself, and you shall lock, bolt, and bar me in until the king's son is gone." So Jack locked, bolted, and barred the giant in the cellar, and then went back and fetched the Prince, and they feasted and made merry, and spent the night very comfortably in the castle. In the morning Jack gave the Prince gold and silver from the giant's treasury. Then the Prince set forth on his journey, while Jack let the giant out of the cellar. The giant thanked Jack very much for saving him, and asked what he should give him as a reward. "Why, good uncle," said Jack, "I desire nothing but the coat and cap, with the rusty sword and the slippers, which are hanging beside the bed." "Take them," said the giant, "and keep them for my sake. They will be very useful to you. The coat will make you invisible, the cap will give you knowledge, the sword will cut through anything, no matter what it may be, and the shoes are of vast swiftness." Jack took the gifts, thanked the giant, and then quickly caught up with the Prince. After a few days' further journey, they reached the dwelling of the beautiful lady whom the Prince had come to rescue. She received the Prince very graciously, and made a feast for him. When it was ended, she rose, and taking her handkerchief, said, "My lord, tomorrow morning I command you to tell me on whom I have bestowed this handkerchief, or else lose your head." The Prince went to bed very mournfully, but Jack put on the cap of knowledge, which told him that the lady was forced by the power of enchantment to meet the wicked magician every night in the forest. He therefore put on his cloak of darkness and his shoes of swiftness, and was there before her. When the lady came, she gave the handkerchief to the magician. Jack, with his sword of sharpness, cut off his head with one blow, and the enchantment was ended in a minute. The next day the lady was married to the Prince, and soon after went with her husband to the court of King Arthur, where Jack was made one of the Knights of the Round Table for his heroism. Very soon Jack set off in search of new adventures. On the 3rd day of his travel he came to a wide forest. Hardly had he entered it when he heard dreadful shrieks and cries, and soon he saw a monstrous giant dragging along by the hair of their heads a handsome knight and a beautiful lady. Their tears and cries melted Jack's heart. He alighted from his horse and put on his invisible coat, and immediately attacked the giant. He could not reach up to the giant's body, so taking a mighty blow he cut off both the monster's legs just below the garter, so that he fell full length upon the ground. Then Jack set his foot upon his neck and plunged the sword into the giant's body. The knight and the lady, overjoyed, begged Jack to come to their house to refresh himself after this fight. But Jack, hearing that the giant had a brother who was more cruel and wicked even than himself, would not rest until he had also destroyed him. So he came in sight of the cavern where the giants lived. There was the other giant sitting on a huge block of timber, with a knotted iron club lying by his side. Jack, in his coat of darkness, was quite invisible. He drew close up to the giant and struck a blow at his head with his sword of sharpness, but he missed his aim and only cut off his nose. The giant roared with pain, and his roars were like claps of thunder. He took up his iron club and began to lay about him, but not being able to see Jack, he could not hit him, for Jack slipped nimbly behind and jumped upon the block of wood, stabbed the giant in the back, and after a few howls the monster dropped down dead. Having thus killed the two monsters, Jack entered the cave to search for the treasure. One room contained a great boiling cauldron and a dining table where the giants feasted. Another part of the cave was barred with iron, and was full of miserable men and women whom the giants had imprisoned. Jack set them all free and divided the treasure among them. Jack cut off the giant's head and sent it with the head of his brother to the court of King Arthur. Then he returned to the house of the knight and his lady. He was received with the greatest joy, and the knight gave a grand feast in his honor. When all the company was gathered together, the knight presented Jack with a ring, on which was engraved the picture of the giant dragging the knight and the lady by the hair, with this motto round it: "Behold, in dire distress were we, under a giant's fierce command, but gained our lives and liberty from valiant Jack's victorious hand." But while the merriment was at its height, a herald rushed into the room and told the company that Thundel, a savage giant with two heads, had heard of the death of his two kinsmen, and was coming to take his revenge on Jack. The guests trembled with terror and fright, but Jack only drew his sword and said, "Let him come." The knight's house was surrounded by a moat, over which there was a drawbridge. Jack set men to work to cut the bridge on both sides, nearly to the middle, and then, dressed in his magic coat, went out to meet the giant. As the giant came along, although he could not see Jack yet, he could tell that someone was near, for he cried out, "Fa, fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread." "Say you so, my friend?" cried Jack. "You are indeed a monstrous miller." "Ah," cried the giant, "you are the villain that killed my kinsman. I will tear you with my teeth and grind your bones to powder." "You must catch me first," said Jack. Then he drew off his coat and put on his shoes of swiftness, and began to run, the giant following him like a walking castle. Jack led him round and round the house, and then he ran over the drawbridge, while the giant rushed after him with his club. But when he came to the middle of the bridge, where it had been cut on both sides, his great weight broke it, and he tumbled into the water. Jack now got a cart rope and flung it over his two heads, and then, by the help of a team of horses, drew him to the edge of the moat, where he cut off his heads. Once again Jack set out in search of new adventures. He went over fields and dales without meeting with any, until he came to the foot of a high mountain. Here was a little lonely house, and when he knocked at the door, it was opened by an old man with a beard as white as snow. This old man was a good hermit, and when Jack had eaten well, he said, "My son, I know that you are the famous conqueror of giants. I know at the top of this mountain there is an enchanted castle, kept by a giant named Galligantes, who, by the help of a magician, gets many knights into his power, whom he changes into beasts. Above all, I lament the hard fate of a duke's daughter, whom they have changed into a deer. Many knights have tried to destroy the enchantment, yet none have been able to do so because of two fiery griffins who guard the gates of the castle. But as you, my son, have an invisible coat, you may pass them by without being seen. On the gates of the castle you will find engraved the means by which the enchantment may be broken." Jack promised that in the morning he would risk his life in an endeavor to break the enchantment, and after a sound sleep he arose early and set out on his attempt. He passed by the fiery griffins without the least fear of danger, for they could not see him because of his invisible coat. On the castle gate he found a golden trumpet hanging, under which were written these words: "Whoever can this trumpet blow shall cause the giant's overthrow." Jack seized the golden trumpet and blew a mighty blast, which made the gates fly open and shook the castle to its foundations. The giant and the magician, knowing that their end was now near, stood biting their thumbs and shaking with terror. Jack, with his magic sword, soon killed the giant, and the magician was carried off by a whirlwind. The castle vanished away like smoke, and the duke's daughter and all the knights and lovely ladies who had been turned into birds and beasts returned to their proper shape. Jack's fame rang through the whole country, and the king gave him a large estate to reward him for all his brave and knightly deeds. And Jack married the duke's daughter, and lived in joy and contentment for the rest of his days. End of chapter 11. Recording by Evan Smith. Chapter 12 of Favorite Fairy Tales by Logan Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Evan Smith. Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack was an idle, lazy boy who would do no work to support his widowed mother, and at last they both came to such poverty that the poor woman had to sell her cow to buy food to keep them from starving. She sent Jack to market with the cow, telling him to be sure and sell it for a good price. As Jack was going along the road to market, he met a butcher. The butcher offered to buy the cow in exchange for a handful of colored beans. Jack thought the beans looked very pretty, and he was glad to be saved the long, hot walk to market. So he struck the bargain on the spot, and went back to his mother with the beans, while the butcher went off with the cow. But the poor widow was very disappointed. She scolded her son for an idle, lazy, good-for-nothing boy, and flung the beans out of the window in a passion. Now the beans were magic beans, and the next morning when Jack awoke he found some of them had taken root in the night, and had grown so tall that they reached right up into the sky. Jack was full of wonder and curiosity, and being fond of adventure and excitement, he set out at once to climb the beanstalk, to see what was up at the top of it. And he climbed, 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 until at last he climbed right up to the very tip-top of the beanstalk. Then he found himself standing in a strange country. In the distance he could see a big castle, and as he was hot and tired with his long climb, he thought he would go and ask for something to eat and drink. He had not gone very far before he met a fairy, who told him that the castle belonged to a wicked ogre, who had killed and eaten a great number of people. "It was he who killed your father," she said, "and it is your duty to do your utmost to destroy the wicked monster. Go now and see what you can do. If you can carry off any of his treasures, you are at liberty to do so, for none of them really belongs to him. He has taken them all by force from the people whom he has robbed and killed." Jack was delighted at the idea of this adventure, and set off in high spirits towards the castle. The castle was farther off than he had thought, and by the time he reached the gates it was so late that he made up his mind to ask for a night's lodging. There was a woman standing in the doorway, but when Jack made his request she was very frightened, and said, "Indeed, I dare not take you in and give you food and lodging. My husband is an ogre who lives on human flesh. If he were to find you here, he would think nothing of eating you up in 3 mouthfuls. I advise you to go away at once before he comes home." But when she saw how tired and hungry Jack really was, she took him into the house and gave him plenty to eat and drink. While Jack was eating his food in the kitchen, there came a loud knocking at the door. The ogre's wife, in a great flurry, hid Jack in the oven, and then hurried to let her husband in. Jack peeped through the oven door and saw a terrible-looking ogre, who came stamping into the kitchen and said in a voice like thunder, "Wife, I smell fresh meat." "It's only the people you are fattening in the dungeon," said the wife. So the ogre sat down and ate his supper. After supper he commanded his wife to bring him his money bags. He then began to count his money, thousands and thousands of pieces of gold and silver. Jack wished he could take some of this money home to his mother, and presently, when the ogre fell asleep, he crept out of his hiding place, and hoisting the bags upon his shoulder, slipped quietly away with them. The ogre was snoring so loudly that it sounded like the wind in the chimney on a stormy night, so he never heard the little noise Jack made, and Jack got safely away and escaped down the beanstalk. His mother was overjoyed to see him, for she had been very anxious about him when he did not come home the night before, and she was delighted with the bags of money, which were enough to keep them in comfort and luxury for some time. For many months Jack and his mother lived happily together, but after a while the money came to an end, and Jack made up his mind to climb the beanstalk again and carry off some more of the ogre's treasures. So one morning he got up early, put on a different suit of clothes, so that the ogre's wife should not recognize him, and set out to climb the beanstalk. And he climbed, 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 until at last he climbed to the very top and found himself in the ogre's country again. When he reached the castle, the ogre's wife was again standing in the doorway. But when Jack asked for a night's lodging, she said she dared not give him one, for only a few months before she had taken in a poor boy who seemed half dead with fatigue and hunger, and in return for her kindness he had stolen some of her husband's money and run away in the night. But Jack begged so hard that at last she relented. She gave him a good supper and hid him in a closet before her husband came home. Presently there was a great noise outside, and heavy footsteps that shook the castle to its foundations. It was the ogre come home. As soon as he entered the kitchen he sniffed suspiciously and said, "I smell fresh meat." "It's only the crows on the housetops," said his wife. "They have brought home a piece of carrion for their young." After supper the ogre told his wife to fetch his hen. This hen was a very wonderful bird. Whenever the ogre said lay, she laid an egg of solid gold. Jack thought that if he could only get this wonderful hen to take home to his mother, they would never want any more. So when the ogre fell asleep, as he did after a little while, he came out of the closet, and seizing the hen in his arms, made off with her. The hen squawked, but the ogre's snoring was like the roaring of the sea when the tide is coming in, and Jack got safely down the beanstalk. The hen laid so many golden eggs that Jack and his mother became quite rich and prosperous, and there was really no need for Jack to go again to the ogre's country. But he liked the danger and excitement, and he remembered that the fairy had told him to take as many of the ogre's treasures as he could, and at last, without saying a word to anybody, he started off once more to climb the magic beanstalk. And he climbed, 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 until at last he reached the very tip-top and stood in the ogre's country. This time, when he reached the castle, he began to be afraid that the ogre's wife really would not let him in. "Indeed and indeed I dare not," she said. "Twice lately have I given shelter to a wayfaring youth, and each time he stole some of my husband's treasures and made off with them. Now my husband has forbidden me, on pain of instant death, to give food or lodging to any traveler." But Jack pleaded and pleaded, and at last the good-natured woman, moved to pity by his travel-stained appearance, gave way and let him into the castle. When the ogre came home, the wife hid Jack in the copper. As usual, the ogre's first words were, "Wife, wife, I smell fresh meat," and in spite of all his wife could say, He insisted upon searching all round the room. Jack was in a terrible fright whilst he was hunting, but fortunately he forgot to look in the copper, and after a time he sat down to his supper. When supper was over, the ogre told his wife to fetch his harp. Jack peeped out of the copper, and saw the harp brought in and set down before the ogre. It was marvellously made, and when the ogre said "play," it played the finest music without being touched. Jack was enchanted, for he had never before heard such wonderful music, and he felt that he must have the harp for his own. The ogre was soon lulled to sleep by the sweet sound of the harp, and when he was snoring heavily, Jack crept out of the copper, and taking up the harp was about to make off with it. But the harp was a fairy harp, and it called out loudly, "Master, master, master!" And although the ogre was snoring so noisily that it was like the sound of 100 dragons roaring at once, yet to Jack's dismay and horror he heard the voice of the harp, and starting to his feet with a bellow of anger, rushed after the daring thief. Jack ran faster than he had ever run in his life before, still carrying the precious harp, while the ogre ran after him, shouting and roaring and making such a noise that it sounded like 1,000 thunderstorms all going at once. If he had not drunk so much wine for supper, the ogre must very soon have caught Jack, but as it was, the wine had got into his head, and so he could not run nearly so fast as usual, and Jack reached the beanstalk just in front of him. It was a very close shave. Jack slid down the beanstalk at his top speed, calling at the top of his voice for his mother to fetch him an axe. The ogre came tumbling down the beanstalk after him, but Jack seized the axe and chopped the beanstalk off close to the root. Down came the beanstalk, down came the ogre, and falling headlong into the garden, he was killed on the spot. After this, Jack quite gave up his lazy, idle ways, and he and his mother, with the magic hen and the wonderful harp, lived in happiness and prosperity the rest of their lives. End of chapter 12. Recording by Evan Smith. Chapter 13 of Favorite Fairy Tales by Logan Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Evan Smith. Dick Whittington and his Cat. In the reign of King Edward III, there was a poor orphan boy named Dick Whittington, living in a country village a long way from London. He was a sharp little lad, and the stories that he heard of London being paved with gold made him long to visit that city. One day a large wagon and 8 horses, with bells at their heads, drove through the village. Dick thought it must be going to London, so he asked the driver to let him walk by the side of the wagon. As soon as the driver heard that poor Dick had neither father nor mother, and saw by his ragged clothes that he could not be worse off than he was, he told him he might go if he would. So they set off together. Dick got safely to London, and was in such a hurry to see the fine streets paved with gold that he ran through many of them, thinking every moment to come to those that were paved with gold. For Dick had seen a guinea 3 times in his own little village, and remembered what a lot of money it brought in change, so he thought he had nothing to do but to take up some little bits of pavement, and he would then have as much money as he could wish for. Poor Dick ran till he was tired, and had quite forgotten his friend the driver. At last, finding it grow dark, and that every way he turned he saw nothing but dirt instead of gold, he sat down in a dark corner and cried himself to sleep. Next morning, being very hungry, he got up and walked about, and asked everybody he met to give him a halfpenny to keep him from starving. At last a good-natured looking gentleman saw how hungry he looked. "Why don't you go to work, my lad?" said he. "I would," answered Dick, "but I do not know how to get any." "If you are willing," said the gentleman, "come with me," and so saying he took him to a hayfield, where Dick worked briskly and lived merrily till the hay was all made. After this he found himself as badly off as before, and being almost starved again, he laid himself down at the door of Mr. Fitzwarren, a rich merchant. Here the cook, an ill-tempered woman, called out to poor Dick, "What business have you here, you lazy rogue? If you do not take yourself away, we will see how you like a sousing with some dishwater I have here that is hot enough to make you jump." At this time Mr. Fitzwarren himself came home to dinner, and when he saw a dirty, ragged boy lying at the door, he said in a kind and gentle voice, "Why do you lie there, my lad? You seem old enough to work. I'm afraid you are lazy." "No, sir," said Dick to him, "I would work with all my heart, but I do not know anybody, and I am sick for want of food." "Poor fellow," answered Mr. Fitzwarren, "get up and let me see what ails you." Dick tried to rise, but he was too weak to stand, for he had not eaten anything for 3 days. So the kind merchant ordered him to be taken into the house, and have a good dinner given to him, and to be kept to do what dirty work he could for the cook. Dick would have lived happily in this good family if it had not been for the ill-natured cook, who was finding fault and scolding him from morning till night; and besides, she was so fond of basting that, when she had no roast meat to baste, she would be basting poor Dick. But though the cook was ill-tempered, the footman was quite different. He had lived in the family many years, and was an elderly gentleman, and very kind-hearted. He had once a little son of his own, who died when about the age of Dick, so he could not help feeling pity for the poor boy, and sometimes gave him a halfpenny to buy gingerbread or a top. The footman was fond of reading, and used often in the evening to entertain the other servants with some amusing book. Little Dick took pleasure in hearing this good man, which made him wish very much to learn to read too. So the next time the footman gave him a halfpenny, he bought a little book with it, and with the footman's help, Dick soon learnt his letters, and afterwards to read. About this time Miss Alice, Mr. Fitzwarren's daughter, was going out one morning for a walk, and Dick was told to put on a suit of good clothes that Mr. Fitzwarren gave him, and walk behind her. As they went, Miss Alice saw a poor woman with one child in her arms and another on her back. She pulled out her purse and gave the woman some money, but as she was putting it into her pocket again, she dropped it on the ground and walked on. It was lucky that Dick was behind, and saw what she had done, for he picked up the purse and gave it to her again. Another time, when Miss Alice was sitting with the window open and amusing herself with a favorite parrot, it suddenly flew away to the branch of a high tree, where all the servants were afraid to venture after it. As soon as Dick heard of this, he pulled off his coat and climbed up the tree as nimbly as a squirrel, and after a great deal of trouble caught her and brought her down safely to his mistress. Miss Alice thanked him, and liked him ever after for this. The ill-humored cook was now a little kinder, but besides this Dick had another hardship to get over. His bed stood in a garret, where there were so many holes in the floor and the walls that every night he was waked in his sleep by the rats and mice, which ran over his face and made such a noise that he sometimes thought the walls were tumbling down about him. One day a gentleman who came to see Mr. Fitzwarren wanted his shoes polished. Dick took great pains to make them shine, and the gentleman gave him a penny. With this he thought he would buy a cat, so the next day, seeing a little girl with a cat under her arm, he went up to her and asked if she would let him have it for a penny. The girl said she would, and that it was a very good mouser. Dick hid the cat in the garret, and always took care to carry a part of his dinner to her, and in a short time he had no more trouble from the rats and mice. Soon after, his master had a ship ready to sail, and as he thought it right all his servants should have some chance for good fortune as well as himself, he called them into the parlor, and asked them if they wanted to take a share in the trading trip. They all had some money that they were willing to venture, except poor Dick, who had neither money nor goods. For this reason he did not come into the parlor with the rest, but Miss Alice guessed what was the matter, and ordered him to be called in. She then said she would put in money for him from her own purse, but her father told her this would not do, for Dick must send something of his own. When poor Dick heard this, he said he had nothing but a cat. "Fetch your cat, then, my good boy," said Mr. Fitzwarren, "and let her go." Dick went upstairs and brought down poor puss, and gave her to the captain with tears in his eyes. All the company laughed at Dick's odd venture, and Miss Alice, who felt pity for the poor boy, gave him some halfpence to buy another cat. This, and other marks of kindness shown him by Miss Alice, made the ill-tempered cook jealous of poor Dick, and she began to use him more cruelly than ever, and always made fun of him for sending his cat to sea. She asked him if he thought his cat would sell for as much money as would buy a stick to beat him. At last poor Dick could not bear this any longer, and thought he would run away from his place. So he packed up his few things, and set out very early in the morning on the 1st of November. He walked as far as Highgate, and there sat down on a stone, which to this day is called Whittington's Stone, and began to think which road he should take farther. While he was thinking what he should do, the bells of Bow Church began to ring, and he fancied their sound seemed to say, "Turn again, Whittington, Lord Mayor of London." "Lord Mayor of London," said he to himself, "why, to be sure, I would put up with almost anything now to be Lord Mayor of London, and ride in a fine coach when I grow to be a man. I will go back and think nothing of the cuffing and scolding of the old cook, if I am to be Lord Mayor of London at last." Dick went back, and was lucky enough to get into the house and set about his work before the cook came down. The ship, with the cat on board, was a long time at sea, and was at last driven by the winds on a part of the coast of Barbary. The people came in great numbers to see the sailors, and treated them very civilly, and when they became better acquainted, were eager to buy the fine things with which the ship was laden. When the captain saw this, he sent patterns of the best things he had to the king of the country, who was so much pleased with them that he sent for the captain and the chief mate to the palace. Here they were placed, as is the custom of the country, on rich carpets marked with gold and silver flowers. The king and queen were seated at the upper end of the room, and a number of dishes of the greatest rarities were brought in for dinner. But before they had been on the table a minute, a vast number of rats and mice rushed in, and helped themselves from every dish. The captain wondered at this, and asked if these vermin were not very unpleasant. "Oh, yes," they said, "and the king would give half of his riches to get rid of them, for they not only waste his dinner, as you see, but disturb him in his bedroom, so that he is obliged to be watched while he is asleep." The captain was ready to jump for joy when he heard of this. He thought of poor Dick's cat, and told the king he had a creature on board his ship that would kill all the rats and mice. The king was still more glad than the captain. "Bring this creature to me," said he, "and if it can do what you say, I will give you your ship full of gold for her." The captain, to make quite sure of his good luck, answered that she was such a clever cat for catching rats and mice that he could hardly bear to part with her, but that to oblige his majesty he would fetch her. "Run, run," said the queen, "for I long to see the creature that will do such service." Away went the captain to the ship, while another dinner was got ready. He came back to the palace soon enough to see the table full of rats and mice again, and the second dinner likely to be lost in the same way as the first. The cat did not wait for bidding, but jumped out of the captain's arms, and in a few moments laid almost all the rats and mice dead at her feet. The rest, in a fright, scampered away to their holes. The king and queen were delighted to get rid of such a plague so easily. They desired that the creature might be brought for them to look at. On this the captain called out, "Puss, puss," and the cat ran and jumped upon his knee. He then held her out to the queen, who was afraid to touch an animal that was able to kill so many rats and mice, but when she saw how gentle the cat seemed, and how glad she was at being stroked by the captain, she ventured to touch her too, saying all the time, "Poot, poot," for she could not speak English. At last the queen took Puss on her lap, and by degrees became quite free with her, till Puss purred herself to sleep. When the king had seen the actions of Mistress Puss, and was told that she would soon have young ones, which might in time kill all the rats and mice in his country, he bought the captain's whole ship's cargo, and afterwards gave him a great deal of gold besides, which was worth still more, for the cat. The captain then took leave, and set sail with a fair wind, and arrived safe at London. One morning, when Mr. Fitzwarren had come into the counting-house and seated himself at the desk, somebody came tap, tap, tap at the door. "Who is there?" said Mr. Fitzwarren. "A friend," answered someone, and who should it be but the captain, followed by several men carrying vast lumps of gold that had been paid him by the King of Barbary for the ship's cargo. Then they told the story of the cat, and showed the rich present that the king had sent to Dick for her, upon which the merchantman called out to his servants, "Go fetch him, we will tell him of the same, pray call him Mr. Whittington by name." Mr. Fitzwarren now showed himself a really good man, for while some of his clerks said so great a treasure was too much for such a boy as Dick, he answered, "I will not keep the value of a single penny from him. It is all his own, and he shall have every farthing's worth of it." He sent for Dick, who happened to be scouring the cook's kettles, and was quite dirty, so that he wanted to excuse himself from going to his master. Mr. Fitzwarren, however, made him come in, and ordered a chair to be set for him, so that poor Dick thought they were going to make fun of him, and began to beg his master not to play tricks with the poor boy, but to let him go again to his work. "Indeed, Mr. Whittington," said the merchant, "we are all in earnest with you, and I heartily rejoice in the news these gentlemen have brought you. For the captain has sold your cat to the King of Barbary, and brought you, in return for her, more riches than I possess, and I wish you may long enjoy them." Mr. Fitzwarren then told the men to open the great treasure they had brought with them, and said, "Mr. Whittington has now nothing to do but to put it in some place of safety." Poor Dick hardly knew how to behave himself for joy. He begged his master to take what part of it he pleased, since he owed it all to his kindness. "No, no," answered Mr. Fitzwarren, "this is all your own, and I have no doubt you will use it well." Dick next asked his mistress and then Miss Alice to accept a part of his good fortune, but they would not, and at the same time told him that his success afforded them great pleasure. But the poor fellow was too kind-hearted to keep it all to himself, so he made a handsome present to the captain, the mate, and every one of the sailors, and afterwards to his good friend the footman, and the rest of Mr. Fitzwarren's servants, and even to the ill-natured cook. After this Mr. Fitzwarren advised him to get himself dressed like a gentleman, and told him he was welcome to live in his house till he could provide himself with a better. When Whittington's face was washed, his hair curled, his hat cocked, and he was dressed in a nice suit of clothes, he was as handsome as any young man who visited at Mr. Fitzwarren's, so that Miss Alice, who had been so kind to him and thought of him with pity, now looked upon him as fit to be her sweetheart, and the more so, no doubt, because Whittington was now always thinking what he could do to oblige her, and making her the prettiest presents that could be. Mr. Fitzwarren soon saw their love for each other, and proposed to join them in marriage, and to this they both readily agreed. A day for the wedding was soon fixed, and they were attended to church by the Lord Mayor, the Court of Aldermen, the sheriffs, and a great number of the richest merchants in London, whom they afterwards treated with a fine feast. History tells us that Mr. Whittington and his lady lived in great splendor and were very happy. They had several children. He was Sheriff of London in the year 1360, and several times afterwards Lord Mayor. The last time he entertained King Henry V on his Majesty's return from the famous Battle of Agincourt. In this company the King, on account of Whittington's gallantry, said, "Never had Prince such a subject." And when Whittington was told this at the table, he answered, "Never had subject such a king." Going with an address from the city on one of the King's victories, he received the honor of knighthood. Sir Richard Whittington supported many poor. He built a church, and also a college with a yearly allowance to poor scholars, and near it raised a hospital. The figure of Sir Richard Whittington, with his cat in his arms, carved in stone, was to be seen till the year 1780 over the archway of the old prison of Newgate, that stood across Newgate Street. End of chapter 13. Recording by Evan Smith. Chapter 14 of Favorite Fairy Tales by Logan Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Evan Smith. The Story of Bluebeard. Many years ago there was a rich man who had a singular blue beard, which made him very ugly. Being left a widower, he wished to marry one of the two beautiful daughters of a neighboring lady, and at last the younger of these girls consented to be his wife. About a month after the marriage, Bluebeard told his bride that he must leave her for a time, as he had some business to attend to at a distance. He gave her his keys, and told her to make free of everything and entertain her friends while he was absent, but ending by drawing one key from the bunch and saying, "This small key belongs to the room at the end of the long gallery, and that, my dear, is the one room you must not enter, not even put the key into the lock. Should you disobey, your punishment would be dreadful." Blue Beard set out on his journey, and for a time his wife found pleasure in showing her friends all her magnificence, but again and again she wondered what could be the reason why she was not to visit the room at the end of the long gallery. At last her curiosity became such that she could not resist the temptation to take just one peep within the forbidden door. When she reached the door, she stopped for a few moments to think of her husband's warning that he would not fail to keep his word should she disobey him, but she was so very curious to know what was inside that she determined to venture in spite of everything. So, with a trembling hand, she put the key into the lock, and the door immediately opened. The window shutters being closed, she at first saw nothing, but in a short time she noticed that the floor was covered with clotted blood, on which the bodies of several dead women were lying. These were all the wives whom Blue Beard had married and murdered one after another. She was ready to sink with fear, and the key of the door, which she held in her hand, fell on the floor. When she had somewhat recovered from her fright, she took it up, locked the door, and hurried to her own room, terrified by what she had seen. As she observed that the key had got stained with blood in falling on the floor, she wiped it 2 or 3 times to clean it, but the blood still remained. She next washed it, but the blood would not go. She then scoured it with brick dust, and afterwards with sand. But notwithstanding all she could do, the blood was still there, for the key was a fairy, who was Blue Beard's friend, so that as fast as she got the stain off one side, it appeared again on the other. Early in the evening Blue Beard returned, saying he had not proceeded far before he was met by a messenger, who told him that the business was concluded without his presence being necessary. His wife said everything she could think of to make him believe that she was delighted at his unexpected return. The next morning he asked for the keys. She gave them, but as she could not help showing her fright, Blue Beard easily guessed what had happened. "How is it," said he, "that the key of the closet upon the ground floor is not here?" "Is it not?" said the wife. "I must have left it on my dressing table." "Be sure you give it to me by and by," replied Blue Beard. After going several times backwards and forwards, pretending to look for the key, she was at last obliged to give it to Blue Beard. He looked at it attentively, and then said, "How came this blood upon the key?" "I am sure I do not know," replied the lady, turning as pale as death. "You do not know," said Blue Beard sternly, "but I know well enough. You have been in the closet on the ground floor. Very well, madam, since you are mightily fond of this closet, you shall certainly take your place among the ladies you saw there." His wife, almost dead with fear, fell upon her knees, asked his pardon 1,000 times for her disobedience, and begged him to forgive her, looking all the time so sorrowful and lovely that she would have melted any heart that was not harder than a rock. But Blue Beard answered, "No, no, madam, you shall die this very minute." "Alas," said the poor creature, "if I must die, allow me at least a little time to say my prayers." "I give you," replied the cruel Blue Beard, "half a quarter of an hour, not one moment longer." When Blue Beard had left her to herself, she called her sister, and after telling her that she had but half a quarter of an hour to live, "Please," said she, "Sister Ann," this was her sister's name, "run up to the tower and see if my brothers are in sight. They promised to come and visit me to-day, and if you see them, make a sign for them to gallop on as fast as possible." Her sister instantly did as she was desired, and the terrified lady every minute called out, "Sister Ann, do you see anyone coming?" And her sister answered, "I see nothing but the sun, which makes a dust, and the grass, which looks green." In the meanwhile Blue Beard, with a great scimitar in his hand, bawled as loud as he could, "Come down instantly, or I will fetch you." "One moment longer, I beseech you," replied she, and again called softly to her sister, "Sister Ann, do you see anyone coming?" To which she answered, I see nothing but the sun, which makes a dust, and the grass, which looks green." Bluebeard again bawled out, "Come down, I say, this very moment, or I shall come and fetch you." "I am coming, indeed I will come in 1 minute," sobbed his unhappy wife. Then she once more cried out, "Sister Ann, do you see anyone coming?" "I see," said her sister, "a cloud of dust a little to the left." "Do you think it is my brothers?" continued the wife. "Alas, no, dear sister," replied she, "it is only a flock of sheep." "Will you come down or not, madam?" said Bluebeard, in the greatest rage imaginable. "Only 1 moment more," answered she, and then she called out for the last time, "Sister Ann, do you see no one coming?" "I see," replied her sister, "2 men on horseback coming to the house, but they are still at a great distance." "God be praised!" cried she. "It is my brothers. Give them a sign to make what haste they can." At the same moment Bluebeard cried out so loud for her to come down that his voice shook the whole house. The poor lady, with her hair loose and her eyes swimming in tears, came down and fell on her knees before Bluebeard, and was going to beg him to spare her life, but he interrupted her, saying, "All this is of no use, for you shall die." Then seizing her with one hand by the hair, and raising the scimitar he held in the other, he was going with one blow to strike off her head. The unfortunate woman, turning toward him, desired to have a single moment allowed her to compose herself. "No, no," said Bluebeard, "I will give you no more time. I am determined. You have had too much already." Again he raised his arm. Just at this instant a loud knocking was heard at the gates, which made Bluebeard wait for a moment to see who it was. The gates were opened, and 2 officers entered with their swords in their hands. Bluebeard, seeing that they were his wife's brothers, endeavored to escape, but they pursued and seized him before he had got 20 steps, and plunged their swords into his body, laid him dead at their feet. The poor wife, who was almost as dead as her husband, was unable at first to rise and embrace her brothers, but she soon recovered. As Bluebeard had no heirs, she found herself the possessor of his great riches. She used part of her vast fortune in giving a marriage dowry to her sister Ann, who soon after was married. With another part she bought captains' commissions for her 2 brothers, and the rest she presented to a most worthy gentleman, whom she married soon after, and whose kind treatment soon made her forget Bluebeard's cruelty. End of chapter 14. Recording by Evan Smith. Chapter 15 of Favorite Fairy Tales by Logan Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Evan Smith. Little Red Riding Hood. Once upon a time there lived a little girl who was so sweet and pretty and good that everybody loved her. Her old grandmother, who was very fond of her, made her a little red cloak and hood, which suited her so well that everyone called her Little Red Riding Hood. One day Little Red Riding Hood's mother told her to take a basket with some butter and eggs and fresh baked cake to her grandmother, who was ill. The little girl, who was always willing and obliging, ran at once to fetch her red cloak, and taking her basket set out on her journey. On her way she met a wolf, who wished very much to eat her up, but who dared not do so because some woodcutters were working close by. So he only said, "Good morning, Little Red Riding Hood. Where are you off to so early?" Little Red Riding Hood, who did not know how dangerous it was to talk to a wolf, replied, "I am going to see my grandmother, who is ill in bed, to take her some butter and eggs and a fresh baked cake that my mother has made for her." "Where does your grandmother live?" asked the wolf. "In the little white cottage at the other side of the wood," answered Red Riding Hood. "Well," said the wolf, "I am going that way too. If you will let me, I will walk part of the way with you." So Little Red Riding Hood, who suspected no harm, set off with the wolf for her companion. Presently Red Riding Hood stopped to gather a nosegay of wild flowers for her grandmother, and the wolf, who had thought of a plan to get the little girl for his dinner, said, "Good morning," and trotted away. As soon as he was out of sight, he began to run as fast as he could. In a short time he reached the grandmother's cottage, and knocked at the door. "Who is there?" asked the old grandmother, as she lay in bed. "It is Little Red Riding Hood," answered the wolf. "I have brought you some butter and eggs and a fresh baked cake which mother has made for you." "Pull the bobbin and the latch will go up," said the old grandmother. So the wolf pulled the bobbin and opened the door, and sprang upon the poor old grandmother and ate her all up in a twinkling. Then he put on her nightcap and got into bed and lay down to wait for Red Riding Hood. Very soon there came a little soft tap at the door. "Who is there?" called out the wolf. "It is Little Red Riding Hood, grandmother dear. I have brought you some butter and eggs and a fresh baked cake which mother has made for you." Then the wolf called out, disguising his voice as much as he could, "Pull the bobbin and the latch will go up." So Little Red Riding Hood pulled the bobbin and went inside. "Good morning, dear grandmother," she said. "How are you feeling today?" "Very bad indeed, my dear," answered the wolf, trying to hide himself under the bedclothes. "How strange and hoarse your voice sounds, grandmother," said the little girl. "I have a bad cold, my dear," said the wicked wolf. "Grandmother, what very bright eyes you have," went on Red Riding Hood, surprised to see how strange her grandmother looked in her nightclothes. "The better to see you with, my dear," said the wolf. "Grandmother, what very big ears you have." "The better to hear you with, my child." "Grandmother, what very long arms you have." "The better to hug you with, my dear." "But, grandmother, what great big teeth you have," said Red Riding Hood, who was beginning to get frightened. "The better to eat you with," roared the wolf, suddenly jumping out of bed. He seized hold of poor Little Red Riding Hood, and was just about to eat her up, when there was a great noise outside, and the door burst open, and in rushed the woodcutters, who had seen the wolf talking to the little girl in the wood, and came to see what mischief he was up to. They killed the wicked wolf quite dead, and so Little Red Riding Hood was saved, and ran home to tell her mother all about her terrible adventure. End of chapter 15. Recording by Evan Smith. Chapter 16 of Favorite Fairy Tales by Logan Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Evan Smith. Sinbad the Sailor. Sinbad the Sailor, after all his adventures and wanderings, settled down in happiness and prosperity in Bagdad. Here are the stories which he told to his friends of his 7 marvelous voyages. The First Voyage. My father died while I was young and left me a fortune. Having no one to restrain me, I fell into bad ways, by which I not only wasted my time, but injured my health and destroyed my property. When I recovered, I collected together what was left of my fortune, and bought merchandise which I loaded on board a vessel for the port of Balsora. During the voyage we touched at several islands, where we sold and exchanged our goods. We were one day becalmed near a small island. As its appearance was inviting, we determined to dine upon it. But while we were laughing and preparing for dinner, the island began to move, and at the same moment the people in the ship called out that we were on the back of a monstrous whale. Some jumped into the boat, and others swam to the ship, but before I could get off, the animal dived into the sea, and I had only time to catch hold of a piece of wood that had been brought from the ship to serve as a table. Upon this piece of timber I was carried away by the current. The others reached the vessel, but a gale sprang up, and the ship sailed without me. I floated during that and the next night, but the following morning was thrown on a small island. I found fresh water and fruit. I looked about for some house, but found none. There were a number of colts grazing together, but no traces of other animals. When evening approached, I took some more fruit and climbed in a tree to sleep. About midnight the sounds of trumpets and drums seemed to pass around the island, which continued until morning, when again it seemed to be uninhabited. On the next day I found that the island was small, and that no other land was in sight. I therefore gave myself up as lost. Nor were my fears lessened when I found that the shore abounded with enormous serpents and other sea monsters. I found, however, that they were timid, and that the rattling of sticks would make them dive into the water. I climbed the tree the next night, and the drums and trumpets returned as before. On the third day I had the satisfaction of seeing a body of men, who, on landing, were astonished to see me there. Having related to them how I came hither, they told me that they were grooms of King Mirage, that the island belonged to genii, who visited it every night with drums and trumpets, that the genii had allowed their sovereign to train his colts upon the island, and that they, being sent every 6 months to select some, had arrived for that purpose. The grooms carried me to King Mirage, who allowed me apartments in his palace. One day I saw men unloading a ship in the harbor, and saw that some of the bales were those which I had sent to Balsora. Going up to the captain, I said, "Captain, I am Sinbad." "Surely," said he, "I and the passengers saw Sinbad swallowed in the waves many 100 miles away." Some others, however, coming up, I was recognized, and the captain then restored me the bales, with many congratulations. I made a valuable present to King Mirage, who bestowed a rich gift on me in return, and having made some advantageous purchases, I arrived at Balsora, where, after I had sold my goods, I found myself possessed of 100,000 sequins. The second voyage. Becoming weary of a quiet life in Balsora, and having bought trading goods, I again went to sea with some merchants. After touching at several places, we landed at an uninhabited island. We amused ourselves in different ways, but I, having taken my wine and provisions, sat down and fell asleep. When I awoke, I found that my companions were gone, and that the ship had sailed. I climbed to the top of a very high tree, and perceived at a distance an object that was very large and white. I descended to the ground, and ran towards this strange-looking object. When I approached it, I found it was about 50 paces in circumference, quite round, and as smooth as ivory, but had no sort of opening. It was now almost sunset, and suddenly the sky became darkened. I looked up, and beheld a bird of enormous size, moving like a prodigious cloud toward me. I recollected that I had heard of a bird called a roc, so large that it could carry away young elephants, and I therefore conjectured that the large object I had been looking at was the egg of this bird. As the bird approached, I crept close to the egg, so that I had one of the legs of this winged animal before me when it alighted. This limb being as large as the trunk of a tree, I tied myself firmly to it with my turban. The next morning the bird flew away, and carried me from this desert island. I was borne so high that I could not see the earth, and then carried downward so swiftly that I lost my senses. When I recovered, I was on the ground. I quickly untied the cloth that bound me, and scarcely was I free when the bird, having taken up a large serpent, again flew away. I found myself in a deep valley, the sides of which were too steep to be climbed. As I walked up and down in despair, I noticed that the valley was covered with diamonds of enormous size. But I soon saw other objects of much less agreeable appearance. Immense serpents were peeping out of holes on every side. When night came, I took shelter in a cave, the entrance of which I guarded with the largest stones I could find, but the hissing of the serpents entirely deprived me of sleep. When day returned, the serpents retired to their holes, and I came out of my cave, but with extreme fear. I walked, heedless of the serpents, until I became weary, and then sat down and fell asleep. I was awakened by something which fell near me. It was a large piece of fresh meat, and presently I saw several other pieces. I was now convinced that I must be in the famous Valley of Diamonds, and that the pieces of meat were thrown in by merchants who expected eagles to pounce upon the flesh, to which diamonds were almost sure to adhere. I hastened to pick up some of the largest diamonds I could find, which I put into a little bag, and fastened it to my girdle. I then selected the largest piece of flesh in the valley, which I tied to my waist with the cloth of my turban, and then lay down upon my face to wait for the eagles. Very soon one of the strongest pounced upon the meat on my back, and flew with me to the nest on the top of the mountain. The merchants began shouting to frighten the eagles, and when they had forced the birds to quit their prey, one of them came to the nest where I was. At first the man was frightened when he saw me there, but after recovering himself, asked me how I got there. I told him and the rest of the merchants my story. I then opened my bag, and they declared that they had never seen diamonds of equal luster and size with mine. The merchants, having gathered their diamonds together, we left the place the next morning and crossed the mountains until we reached a port. We there took ship and proceeded to the island of Roa. At that place I exchanged some of my diamonds for other merchandise, and we went on to Balsora. From Balsora I reached my native city, Bagdad, in which I lived easily upon the vast riches I had won. The Third Voyage. I soon resolved upon a third voyage, and once more took ship at Balsora. After we had been at sea a few weeks, we were overtaken by a dreadful storm, and were obliged to cast anchor near an island which the captain had endeavored to avoid, for he assured us that it was inhabited by pygmy savages, covered with hair, who would speedily attack us in great numbers. Soon an innumerable multitude of frightful savages, about 2 feet high, boarded the ship. Resistance was useless. They took down our sails, cut our cable, towed the ship to land, and made us all go on shore. We went towards the interior of the island, and discovered a large building. It was a lofty palace, having a gate of ebony, which we pushed open, and soon discovered a room in which were human bones and roasting spits. Presently there appeared a hideous black man, who was as tall as a palm tree. He had but one eye, his teeth were long and sharp, and his nails like the talons of a bird. He took me up as I would a kitten, but finding I was little better than skin and bone, put me down with contempt. The captain, being the fattest of the party, was sacrificed to his appetite. When the monster had finished his meal, he stretched himself upon a great stone bench in the portico, and fell asleep, snoring louder than thunder. In this manner he slept till morning. In the morning he went out. I said to my companions, "Do not waste time in useless sorrow. Let us hurry to look for timber to make rafts." We found some timber on the seashore, and labored hard, but having no tools, it was evening before we had finished, and while we were on the point of pushing the raft off the beach, our hideous tyrant returned and drove us to his palace, as if we had been a flock of sheep. We saw another of our companions sacrificed, and the giant lay down to sleep as before. Our desperate condition gave us courage. 9 of us got up very softly, and held the points of the roasting spits in the fire till we made them red hot. Then we thrust them at once into the monster's eye. He uttered a frightful scream, and having tried in vain to find us, opened the ebony gate and left the palace. We did not stay long behind him, but ran to the seashore, got our rafts ready, and waited for daylight to embark. But at dawn we beheld our monstrous enemy, led by 2 giants of equal size, and followed by many others. We jumped upon our rafts, and pushed them from the shore, the tide helping us. The giants, seeing us likely to escape, tore great pieces of rock, and wading in the water up to their waists, hurled them at us with all their might. They sank every one of the rafts but that on which I was. Thus my companions, except 2, were drowned. We rowed as fast as we could, and got out of the reach of these monsters. We were at sea 2 days, but at last found a pleasant island. After eating some fruit, we lay down to sleep, but were soon awakened by the hissing of an enormous serpent. One of my comrades was instantly devoured by this terrific creature. I climbed up a tree as fast as I could, and reached the uppermost branches. My remaining companion was following me, but the dreadful reptile entwined itself around the tree and caught him. The serpent then went down and glided away. I waited until late the next day before I ventured to descend. Evening again approached, and I gathered together a great quantity of small wood, brambles, and thorns. Having made them into faggots, I formed a circle around the tree, and fastened the uppermost to the branches of the tree. I then climbed up to the highest branches. At night the serpent came again, but could not reach the tree, and crawling vainly round and round my little fortification until daylight, he went away. The next day I spied a ship in full sail a long way off. With the linen of my turban I made a signal, which was perceived. I was taken on board the ship, and there told my adventures. The captain was very kind to me. He said that he had some bales of goods which had belonged to a merchant who had unintentionally left him some time ago on an uninhabited island. As this man was undoubtedly dead, he intended to sell the goods for the benefit of his relatives, and I should have the profit of selling them. I now recollected this was the captain with whom I sailed on my second voyage. I soon convinced him that I was really Sinbad, whom he supposed to have been lost. He was delighted at the discovery, and eagerly acknowledged that the property was mine. I continued my voyage, sold my goods to great advantage, and returned to Baghdad. My fourth voyage. My desire of seeing foreign countries rendered my pleasures at home unsatisfactory. I therefore arranged my affairs, commenced a voyage to Persia, and having bought a large stock of goods, loaded a ship and again embarked. The ship struck upon a rock, and the cargo was lost. A few others and myself were borne by the current to an island, on which we were surrounded by black savages and carried to their huts. The savages offered us herbs. My companions eagerly took them, for they were hungry. Grief would not allow me to eat, and presently I saw that the herbs had made my comrades senseless. Rice, mixed with oil of coconuts, was then offered to us, which my companions ate greedily and grew fat. My unhappy friends were then devoured one after another, having become appetizing to the cannibals. But I languished so much that they did not think me fit to eat. They left me to the care of an old man, from whom I managed to escape, and taking care to go a contrary way from that which the savages had taken, I never stopped till night. At the end of 7 days, on the seashore, I found a number of white persons gathering pepper. They asked me in Arabic who I was, and whence I came, and I gave them an account of the shipwreck and of my escape. They treated me kindly, and presented me to their king, who treated me with great liberality. During my stay with them, I observed that when the king and his nobles went hunting, they rode their horses without bridle or saddle. With the assistance of some workmen, I made a bridle and saddle, and having put them upon one of the king's horses, presented the animal thus equipped to his majesty. He was so delighted that he instantly mounted and rode about the grounds almost the whole day. All the ministers of state and the nobility induced me to make saddles and bridles for them, for which they made me such magnificent presents that I soon became very rich. The king at last requested that I would marry and become one of his nation. From a variety of circumstances I could not refuse, and he therefore gave me one of the ladies of his court, who was young, rich, beautiful, and virtuous. We lived in the greatest harmony in a palace belonging to my wife. I had made a good friend of a very worthy man who lived in this place. Hearing one day that his wife had just died, I went to condole with him on this unexpected calamity. We were alone together, and he appeared to be in the deepest grief. After I had talked with him some time on the uselessness of so much sorrow, he told me that it was an established law that the living husband should be buried with the deceased wife, and that within an hour he must submit. I shuddered at the dreadful custom. In a short time the woman was attired in her most costly dress and jewels, and placed in an open coffin. The procession then began, the husband following the corpse. They ascended to the top of an exceedingly high mountain, and a great stone was removed, which covered the mouth of a deep pit. The corpse was let down, and the husband, having taken leave of his friends, was put into another open coffin, with a pot of water and 7 small loaves, and he was let down. The stone was replaced, and they all returned. The horror of this was still fresh upon my mind when my wife fell sick and died. The king and the whole court, out of respect to me, instantly prepared to assist at a similar ceremony with me. I restrained the feeling of despair until we arrived at the top of the mountain, when I fell at the feet of the king and begged him to spare my life. All I said was ineffectual, and after my wife was let down, I also was put into the deep pit, everyone being totally indifferent to my cries and lamentations. I made the cave echo with my vain complaints. I lived some days on the bread and water which had been put in my coffin, but this supply was at length exhausted. I then wandered to a remote part of this frightful cave, and lay down to prepare for death. I was thus wishing only for a speedy termination of my misery, when I heard something walking and panting. I started up, upon which the thing panted still more, and then ran away. I pursued it, and sometimes it seemed to stop, but on my approach continued to go on before me. I pursued it until at last I saw a glimmering light like a star. This redoubled my eagerness, until at last I discovered a hole large enough to allow my escape. I crept through the aperture, and found myself on the seashore, and discovered that the creature was a sea monster which had been accustomed to enter at that hole to feed upon the dead bodies. Having eaten some shellfish, I returned to the cave, where I collected all the jewels I could find in the dark. These I carried to the seashore, and tied them up very neatly into bales with the cords that let down the coffins. I laid them on the beach, waiting till some ship should pass. In 2 days a ship came out of the harbor, and passed by that part of the coast. I made a signal, and a boat took me on board. I was obliged to say that I had been wrecked, for had they known my real story I should have been carried back, as the captain was a native of this country. We touched at several islands, and at the port of Kella, where I found a ship ready to sail for Balsora, and having presented some jewels to the captain, who had brought me to Kella, I sailed and at last arrived at Baghdad. The Fifth Voyage. Having forgotten my former perils, I built a ship at my own expense, loaded it with a rich cargo, and taking with me other merchants, once more set sail. We were much driven about by a storm, and at length landed upon a desert island to search for fresh water. There we found a roc's egg, equal in size to the one I had seen before. The merchants and sailors gathered round it, and though I advised them not to meddle with it, they nevertheless made a hole in it with their hatchets, and picked out the young rock, piece after piece, and roasted it. They had scarcely finished, when 2 of the old birds appeared in the air. We hurried on board ship, and set sail, but had not gone far before we saw the immense birds approaching us, and soon after they hovered over the ship. One of them let fall an enormous fragment of stone, which fell into the sea close by the ship, but the other let fall a piece which split our ship. I caught hold a bit of the wreck, on which I was borne by the wind and tide to an island, the shore of which was very steep. I reached the dry land, and found the most delicious fruits and excellent water, which refreshed me. Farther in the island I saw a feeble old man sitting near a rivulet. When I inquired of him how he came there, he only answered by signs, for me to carry him over the rivulet, that he might eat some fruit. I took him on my back, and crossed the brook, but instead of getting down, he clasped his legs so firmly round my throat that I thought he would strangle me. I soon fainted with pain and fright. When I recovered, the old fellow was still sitting on my neck, and he quickly made me rise up and walk under the trees, while he gathered the fruit at his ease. This lasted a long time. One day, while carrying him about, I picked up a large gourd called a calabash, and having cleared out the inside, I pressed into it the juice of grapes. Having filled it, I left it for several days, and at length found that it became excellent wine. I drank of this, and for a while forgot my sorrows, so that I began to sing with cheerfulness. The old man made me give him the calabash, and liking the flavor of the wine, he drank it off, soon became intoxicated, fell from my shoulders, and died in convulsions. I hastened to the seaside, and presently found the crew of a ship. They told me I had fallen into the hands of the Old Man of the Sea, and was the first person that had ever escaped. I sailed with them, and the captain, when we landed, took me to some persons whose employment was to gather cocoanuts. We all took up stones and pelted the monkeys that were at the very top of the cocoanut trees, and these animals in return pelted us with cocoanuts. When we had obtained as many as we could carry, we returned to the town. I soon obtained a considerable sum by the cocoanuts I thus gathered, and at length sailed for my native land. The Sixth Voyage. At the expiration of another year, I prepared for a 6th voyage. This proved very long and unfortunate, for the pilot lost his course and knew not where to steer. At length he told us we must inevitably be dashed to pieces against a rock which we were fast approaching. In a few moments the vessel was a complete wreck. We saved our lives, our provisions, and our goods. The shore on which we were cast was at the foot of a mountain which was impossible to climb, so that I shortly beheld my companions die one after another. There was a frightful cavern in the rock, through which flowed a river. To this, in a fit of desperation, I resolved to trust myself. I went to work and made a long raft. I loaded it with bales of rich stuffs and large pieces of rock crystal, of which the mountain was in great measure formed. I went on board the raft, and the current carried me along. I was carried in darkness during many days, and at last fell asleep. When I awoke, I found myself in a pleasant country. My raft was tied up, and some blacks who were near me said that they had found me floating in the river which waters their land. They took me to their king, and carefully conducted my cargo with me. When we came to the city of Serendib, I related my story to the monarch, who ordered it be written in letters of gold. I presented the king with some of the most beautiful pieces of rock crystal, and entreated him to let me return to my own country, which he readily agreed to, and even gave me a letter and a present to my sovereign, the Caliph Haroun al-Rashid. The present consisted of a ruby made into a cup and decorated with pearls, the skin of a serpent which appeared like burnished gold and which could repel disease, some aloe wood, camphor, and a beautiful female slave. I returned to my native country, delivered the present to the Caliph, and received his thanks with a reward. The seventh and last voyage. The Caliph Haroun al-Rashid one day sent for me, and told me I must bear a present to the king of Serendib. I ventured to protest on account of my age, but I could not persuade him to give up his plan. I arrived at Serendib and prayed an audience with the king. I was conducted to the palace with great respect, and delivered to the monarch the Caliph's letter and present. The present consisted of the most ingenious and valuable works of art, with which the king was exceedingly delighted, and he was also pleased to acknowledge how much he esteemed my services. When I departed, the monarch bestowed on me some rich gifts, but the ship had not long been at sea before it was attacked by pirates, who seized the vessel and carried us away as slaves. I was sold to a merchant. When my master found that I could use the bow and arrow with skill, he took me upon an elephant and carried me to a vast forest in the country. My master ordered me to climb a high tree and wait there until I saw a troop of elephants pass by. I was then to shoot at them, and if one of them fell, I was to go to the city and give the merchant notice. Having given me these directions and a bag of provisions, he left me. On the morning of the second day I saw a great number of elephants. I succeeded in shooting one of them, upon which the others went away, and I returned to the city and told my employer, who praised my work. We went back to the forest and dug a hole in which the elephant was to remain until it decayed and left the teeth free. I continued this trade nearly 2 months, and killed an elephant almost every day. One morning all the elephants came up to the tree in which I was, and trumpeted dreadfully. One of them fastened his trunk round the tree and tore it up by the roots. I fell with the tree. The animal took me up with his trunk and placed me on his back, and then, at the head of his troop, he brought me to a place where he gently laid me on the ground, and they all went away. I discovered that I was upon a large broad hill, covered all over with the bones and teeth of elephants, and was soon convinced that this was their burying place. I reached the city once more. My master thought I was lost, for he had seen the torn tree and found my bow and arrows. I told him what had happened, and led him up to the hill. We loaded the elephant on which we had come, and thus collected more teeth than a man could have obtained in his whole life. The merchant told me that not only he himself, but the whole city was indebted to me, and that I should return to my own country with sufficient wealth to make me happy. My patron loaded a ship with ivory, and the other merchants made me valuable presents. I reached Balsora and landed my ivory, which I found to be more valuable than I had expected. I set out with caravans to travel overland, and at last reached Bagdad, where I presented myself to the Caliph and gave an account of my embassy. He was so astonished at my adventure with the elephants that he ordered the narrative of it to be written in letters of gold and to be deposited in his treasury. End of chapter 16. Recording by Evan Smith. Chapter 17 of Favorite Fairy Tales by Logan Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Evan Smith. Hansel and Gretel. Once upon a time there dwelt near a large wood a poor woodcutter, with his wife and 2 children by his former marriage, a little boy named Hansel and a girl named Gretel. He had little enough to eat, and once, when there was a great famine in the land, he could not get even his daily bread. As he lay thinking in his bed one evening, rolling about for trouble, he sighed and said to his wife, "What will become of us? How can we feed our children when we have no more than we can eat ourselves?" "Well, then, my husband," answered she, "we will lead them away, quite early in the morning, into the thickest part of the wood, and there make them a fire, and give them each a little piece of bread. Then we will go to our work and leave them alone, so they will not find the way home again, and we shall be freed from them." "No, wife," replied he, "that I can never do. How can you bring your heart to leave my children all alone in the wood, for the wild beasts will soon come and tear them to pieces?" "Oh, you simpleton," said she, "then we must all 4 die of hunger." But she gave him no peace until he consented, saying, "Ah, but I shall regret the poor children." The 2 children, however, had not gone to sleep for very hunger, and so they overheard what the stepmother said to their father. Gretel wept bitterly, and said to Hansel, "What will become of us?" "Be quiet, Gretel," said he. "Do not cry. I will soon help you." And as soon as their parents had fallen asleep, he got up, put on his coat, and, unbarring the back door, slipped out. The moon shone brightly, and the white pebbles which lay before the door seemed like silver pieces, they glittered so brightly. Hansel stooped down and put as many into his pocket as it would hold, and then, going back, he said to Gretel, "Be comforted, dear sister, and sleep in peace. God will not forsake us." And so saying, he went to bed again. The next morning, before the sun arose, the wife went and awoke the 2 children. "Get up, you lazy things. We are going into the forest to chop wood." Then she gave them each a piece of bread, saying, "There is something for your dinner. Do not eat it before the time, for you will get nothing else." Gretel took the bread in her apron, for Hansel's pocket was full of pebbles, and so they all set out upon their way. When they had gone a little distance, Hansel stood still and peeped back at the house, and this he repeated several times, till his father said, "Hansel, what are you peeping at, and why do you lag behind? Take care, and remember your legs." "Ah, father," said Hansel, "I am looking at my white cat sitting upon the roof of the house, and trying to say good-bye." "You simpleton," said the wife, "that is not a cat, it is only the sun shining on the white chimney." But in reality Hansel was not looking at a cat, but every time he stopped he dropped a pebble out of his pocket upon the path. When they came to the middle of the wood, the father told the children to collect wood, and he would make them a fire, so that they should not be cold. So Hansel and Gretel gathered together quite a little mountain of twigs. Then they set fire to them, and as the flame burnt up high, the wife said, "Now you children lie down near the fire and rest yourselves, while we go into the forest and chop wood. When we are ready I will come and call you." Hansel and Gretel sat down by the fire, and when it was noon, each ate the piece of bread. And because they could hear the blows of an axe, they thought their father was near. But it was not an axe, but a branch which he had bound to a withered tree, so as to be blown to and fro by the wind. They waited so long that at last their eyes closed from weariness, and they fell fast asleep. When they awoke it was quite dark, and Gretel began to cry. "How shall we get out of the wood?" But Hansel tried to comfort her, saying, "Wait a little while till the moon rises, and then we will quickly find the way." The moon soon shone forth, and Hansel, taking his sister's hand, followed the pebbles, which glittered like new coined silver pieces, and showed them the path. All night long they walked on, and as day broke they came to their father's house. They knocked at the door, and when the wife opened it and saw Hansel and Gretel, she exclaimed, "You wicked children, why did you sleep so long in the wood? We thought you were never coming home again." But their father was very glad, for it had grieved his heart to leave them all alone. Not long afterwards there was again great scarcity in every corner of the land, and one night the children overheard their mother saying to their father, "Everything is again eaten. We have only half a loaf left, and then we must starve. The children must be sent away. We will take them deeper into the wood, so that they may not find their way out again. It is the only means of escape for us." But the husband felt heavy at heart, and thought it were better to share the last crust with the children. His wife, however, would listen to nothing that he said, and scolded and reproached him without end. Now the children had heard what had been said as they lay awake, and as soon as the old people went to sleep, Hansel got up, intending to pick up some pebbles as before, but the wife had locked the door, so that he could not get out. Nevertheless he comforted Gretel, saying, "Do not cry, sleep in peace, the good God will not forsake us." Early in the morning the stepmother came and pulled them out of bed, and gave them each a slice of bread, which was still smaller than the one they had the last time. On the way Hansel broke his in his pocket, and stooping every now and then, dropped a crumb upon the path. "Hansel, why do you stop and look about?" said the father. "Keep in the path." "I am looking at my little dove," answered Hansel, nodding a good-bye to me. "Simpleton," said the wife, "that is no dove, but only the sun shining on the chimney." But Hansel kept still dropping crumbs as he went along. The mother led the children deep into the woods, where they had never been before, and there, making an immense fire, she said to them, "Sit down here and rest, and when you feel tired you can sleep for a little while. We are going into the forest to hew wood, and in the evening, when we are ready, we will come and fetch you." When noon came, Gretel shared her bread with Hansel, who had strewn his on the path. They then went to sleep, but the evening arrived, and no one came to visit the poor children, and in the dark night they awoke, and Hansel comforted his sister by saying, "Only wait, Gretel, till the moon comes out. Then we shall see the crumbs of bread which I have dropped, and they will show us the way home." When the moon shone they got up, but they could not see any crumbs, for the thousands of birds which had been flying about in the woods and fields had picked them all up. Hansel kept saying to Gretel, "We will soon find the way," but they did not. They walked the whole night long and the next day, but still they did not come out of the wood, and they got very hungry, for they had nothing to eat but the berries which they found upon the bushes. Soon they got so tired that they could not drag themselves along, so they lay down under a tree and went to sleep. It was now the third morning since they had left their father's house, and they still walked on, but they only got deeper and deeper into the wood, and Hansel saw that if help did not come very soon they would die of hunger. About the middle of the day they saw a beautiful snow-white bird sitting on a bough, which sang so sweetly that they stood still and listened to it. It soon left off, and spreading its wings flew away. They followed it until it arrived at a cottage, upon the roof of which it perched, and when they got close up to it, they saw the cottage was made of bread and cakes, and the window panes were of clear sugar. "We will go in here," said Hansel, "and have a glorious feast. I will eat a piece of the roof, and you can eat the window. Will they not be sweet?" So Hansel reached up and broke a piece off the roof, in order to see how it tasted, while Gretel stepped up to the window and began to bite it. Then a sweet voice called out in the room, "Tip tap, tip tap, who raps at my door?" And the children answered, the wind, the child of heaven," and they went on eating. Hansel thought the roof tasted very nice, and so he tore off a great piece, while Gretel broke a large round pane out of the window and sat down quite contentedly. Just then the door opened, and a very old woman, walking upon crutches, came out. Hansel and Gretel were so frightened that they let fall what they had in their hands, but the old woman, nodding her head, said, "Ah, you dear children, what has brought you here? Come in and stay with me, and no harm shall befall you." And so saying, she took them both by the hand and led them into her cottage. A good meal of milk and pancakes, with sugar, apples, and nuts, was spread on the table, and in the back room were two nice little beds, covered with white, where Hansel and Gretel laid themselves down and rested happily after all their hardships. The old woman was very kind to them, but in reality she was a wicked witch who waylaid children, and built the bread house in order to entice them in. Then, as soon as they were in her power, she killed them, cooked and ate them, and made a great festival of the day. Witches have red eyes, and cannot see very far, but they have a fine sense of smell like wild beasts, so that they know when children approach them. When Hansel and Gretel came near the witch's house, she laughed wickedly, saying, "Here come two who shall not escape me." And early in the morning, before they awoke, she went up to them, and saw how lovingly they lay sleeping, with their chubby red cheeks, and she mumbled to herself, "That will be a good bite." Then she took up Hansel with her rough hand, and shut him up in a little cage with a lattice door, and although he screamed loudly, it was of no use. Gretel came next, and shaking her till she awoke, she said, "Get up, you lazy thing, and fetch some water to cook something good for your brother, who must remain in that stall and get fat. When he is fat enough I shall eat him." Gretel began to cry, but it was all useless, for the old witch made her do as she wished. So a nice meal was cooked for Hansel, but Gretel got nothing but a crab's claw. Every morning the old witch came to the cage and said, "Hansel, stretch out your finger that I may feel whether you are getting fat." But Hansel used to stretch out a bone, and the old woman, having very bad sight, thought that it was his finger, and wondered very much that he did not get fatter. When 4 weeks had passed, and Hansel was still quite lean, she lost all her patience, and would not wait any longer. "Gretel," she called out in a passion, "get some water quickly. Be Hansel fat or lean, this morning I will kill and cook him." Oh, how the poor little sister grieved, as she was forced to fetch the water, and fast the tears ran down her cheeks. "Dear good God, help us now," she exclaimed. "Had we only been eaten by the wild beasts in the wood, then we should have died together." But the old witch called out, "Stop that noise, it will not help you a bit." So early in the morning Gretel was forced to go out and fill the kettle and make a fire. "First we will bake, however," said the old woman. "I have already heated the oven and kneaded the dough." And so saying, she pushed poor Gretel up to the oven, out of which the flames were burning fiercely. "Creep in," said the witch, "and see if it is hot enough, and then we will put in the bread." But she intended, when Gretel got in, to shut up the oven and let her bake, so that she might eat her as well as Hansel. Gretel saw what her thoughts were, and said, "I do not know how to do it. How shall I get in?" "You stupid goose," said she, "the opening is big enough. See, I could even get in myself." And she got up and put her head into the oven. Then Gretel gave her a push, so that she fell right in, and then, shutting the iron door, she bolted it. Oh, how horribly she howled, but Gretel ran away and left the wicked witch to burn to ashes. Now she ran to Hansel, and opening the door, called out, "Hansel, we are saved. The old witch is dead." So he sprang out like a bird out of his cage when the door is opened, and they were so glad that they fell upon each other's neck and kissed each other over and over again. And now, as there was nothing to fear, they went into the witch's house, where in every corner were caskets full of pearls and precious stones. "These are better than pebbles," said Hansel, putting as many into his pocket as it would hold, while Gretel thought, "I will take some home too," and filled her apron full. "We must be off now," said Hansel, "and get out of this enchanted forest." When they had walked for 2 hours, they came to a large piece of water. "We cannot get over it," said Hansel. "I can see no bridge at all." "And there is no boat either," said Gretel. "But there swims a white duck. I will ask her to help us over." And she sang: "Little duck, so blithe and merry, Hansel, Gretel, here we stand. There is neither bridge nor ferry, Row us on your back to land." So the duck came to them, and Hansel sat himself on her back, and bade his sister sit behind him. "No," answered Gretel, "that will be too much for the duck. She shall take us over one at a time." This the good little bird did, and when both were happily arrived on the other side, and had gone a little way, they came to a wood, which they knew the better every step they went, and at last they saw their father's house. Then they began to run, and bursting into the house, they fell on their father's neck. He had not had one happy hour since he had left the children in the forest, and his wife was dead. Gretel shook her apron, and the pearls and precious stones rolled out on the floor, and Hansel threw down one handful after another out of his pocket. Then all their sorrows were ended, and they lived together in great happiness. End of chapter 17. Recording by Evan Smith. Chapter 18 of Favorite Fairy Tales by Logan Marshall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Evan Smith. The Goose Girl. Once upon a time there lived an old queen, whose husband had been dead some years, and left her with one child, a beautiful daughter. When this daughter grew up, she was to be married to a king's son, who lived far away. Now when the time came for her to leave, the mother gave her daughter a lock of hair, saying, "Dear child, preserve this well, and it will keep you out of trouble." Afterwards the mother and daughter took a sorrowful leave of each other, and the princess placed the lock of hair in her bosom, mounted her horse Falada, and rode away to her intended bridegroom. Now this horse could speak. After she had ridden for about an hour, she became very thirsty, and said to her servant, "Dismount and bring me some water from yonder stream in the cup which you carry with you, for I am very thirsty." "If you are thirsty," replied the servant, "dismount yourself, and stoop down to drink the water, for I will not be your maid." The princess, on account of her great thirst, did as she was bid, and bending over the brook she drank of its water without daring to use her golden cup. While she did so, the lock of hair said, "Ah, if thy mother knew this, her heart would break." As she leaned over the water, the lock of hair fell out of her bosom and floated down the stream without her noticing it, because of her great anguish. But her servant had seen what happened, and she was glad, for now she had power over her mistress, because with the loss of the lock of hair she became weak and helpless. When, then, the princess was going to mount her horse again, the maid said, "No, Falada belongs to me. You must get upon this horse." And she was forced to yield. Then the servant bade her take off her royal clothes, and put on her common ones instead, and lastly she made the princess promise and swear by the open sky that she would say naught of what had passed at the king's palace, for if she had not sworn she would have been murdered. But Falada, the horse, observed all that passed with great attention. Then the servant mounted upon Falada, and the rightful princess upon a sorry hack, and in that way they travelled until they came to the king's palace. On their arrival there were great rejoicings, and the young prince, running towards them, lifted the servant off her horse, supposing that she was the true bride, and she was led up the steps in state, while the real princess had to stop below. Just then the old king chanced to look out of his window, and saw her standing in the court, and he remarked how delicate and beautiful she was. And going to the royal apartments, he inquired there of the bride who it was she had brought with her, and left below in the courtyard. "Only a girl whom I brought with me for company," said the bride. "Give the wench some work to do, that she may not grow idle." The old king, however, had no work for her, and knew of nothing, until at last he said, "Ah, there's a boy who keeps the geese. She can help him." This youth was called Conrad, and the true bride was set to keep geese with him. Soon after this the false bride said to her betrothed, "Dearest, will you grant me a favor?" "Yes," said he, "with the greatest pleasure." Then let the butcher be summoned, that he may cut off the head of the horse on which I rode hither, for it has angered me on the way." In reality, she feared lest the horse might tell how she had used the rightful princess, and she was glad when it was decided that Falada should die. This came to the ears of the princess, and she promised secretly to the butcher to give him a piece of gold if he would show her a kindness, which was, that he would nail the head of Falada over a certain large and gloomy arch, through which she had to pass daily with the geese, so that then she might still see her old steed as she had been accustomed. The butcher promised, and after killing the horse, nailed the head to the place which the princess pointed out over the door of the arch. Early in the morning, when she and Conrad drove the geese through the arch, she said in passing, "Ah, Falada, that you hang so high!" And the head replied, "Ah, princess, that you go humbly by! Thy mother's heart would surely break, were she to know of your heartache." Then she drove on through the town to a field. When they arrived in the meadow, she sat down and unloosened her hair, which was of pure gold. Its shining appearance so charmed Conrad that he tried to pull out a couple of locks. So she sang, "Blow, blow, thou wind, blow Conrad's hat away." Immediately there came up a strong wind, which snatched Conrad's hat off his head, and led him on a rare chase, and when he returned, what with combing and curling, the princess had rearranged her hair so that he could not catch a loose lock. This made Conrad very angry, and he would not speak to her, so all day long they tended their geese in silence. After their return home, Conrad went to the old king and declared that he would no longer keep geese with the servant. "Why not?" asked the old king. "Ah, she vexes me the whole day long," said Conrad, and then the king bade him tell all that had happened. So Conrad did, and told how in the morning, when they passed through a certain archway, she spoke to a horse's head, which was nailed up over the door, and said, "Ah, Falada, that you hang so high!" And it replied, "Ah, princess, that you go humbly by! Thy mother's heart would surely break, were she to know of your heartache." And further, he told how, when they arrived in the meadow, she caused the wind to blow his hat off, so that he had to run after it ever so far. When he had finished his tale, the old king ordered him to drive the geese out again the next morning, and he himself, when morning came, stationed himself behind the gloomy archway, and heard the servant talk to the head of Falada. Then he followed them into the fields. There he saw with his own eyes the goose girl and boy drive in the geese, and after a while she sat down, and unloosening her hair, which shone like gold, began to sing the old rhyme, "Blow, blow, thou wind, blow Conrad's hat away." Then the king felt a breeze come, which took off Conrad's hat so that he had to run a long way after it, while the goose girl combed out her hair and put it back in proper trim before his return. All this the king observed, and then went home unnoticed, and when the goose girl returned at evening, he called her aside and asked her what it all meant. "That I dare not tell you, nor any other man," replied she, "for I have sworn by the free sky not to speak of my griefs, else lose my life." The king pressed her to say what it was, and left her no peace about it, but still she refused. So at last he said, "If you will not tell me, tell your griefs to this fireplace," and he went away. Then she crept into the fireplace and began to weep and groan, and soon she relieved her heart by telling her tale. "Here sit I," she said, "forsaken by all the world, and yet I am a king's daughter, and a false servant has exercised some charm over me whereby I was compelled to lay aside my royal clothes, and she has also taken my place at the bridegroom's side, and I am forced to perform the common duties of a goose girl. Oh, if my mother knew this, her heart would break with grief." The old king, meanwhile, stood outside by the chimney and listened to what she said, and when she had finished he came in and called her away from the fireplace. Then her royal clothes were put on, and the old king, calling his son, showed him that he had taken a false bride, who was only a servant girl, and that the true bride stood there as a goose girl. The Prince was glad indeed at heart when he saw her beauty and virtue. Then there was a great feast, at which the bridegroom sat with the Princess on one side and the servant girl on the other. But the latter was dazzled, and recognized her mistress no longer in her shining dress. When they had finished their feasting, and were beginning to be gay, the old king set a riddle to the real servant girl. What such a one were worthy of, who had, in such and such a manner, deceived her masters, and he related all that had happened to the true bride. The servant girl replied, "Such a one deserves nothing better than to be put into a cask lined with sharp nails, and then to be dragged by 2 horses through the streets till the wretch be killed." "You are the woman, then," exclaimed the king. "You have proclaimed your own punishment, and it shall be strictly fulfilled." The sentence was at once carried out, and afterwards the prince married his rightful bride, and they lived long in peace and happiness. End of chapter 18. Recording by Evan Smith. End of Favorite Fairy Tales by Logan Marshall.